You're listening to the Play Therapy Parenting Podcast with Dr. Brenna Hicks.
Hi, I'm Dr. Brenna Hicks, the Kid Counselor. This is the Play Therapy Parenting Podcast, where I give you insight, awareness, and enlightenment about your parenting and your relationship with your kids. In today's episode, I am asking a question that was actually submitted by a therapist on behalf of a parent. So I know I have a lot of carryover listeners between my parenting podcast and my play therapy podcast. So I so appreciate that therapists are referring to parents and parents are listening to the therapist podcast. And I think there's a really cool crossover that's happening. So a therapist emailed on behalf of a parent, and it's specifically about a 6-year-old girl with some body image issues. So I'll read parts of the question and I'll hit some highlights for you, and then we'll kind of dive into some thoughts specifically on how to best handle a child that is really struggling with body image and eating and all of those types of concerns. So the question that I got is, there's a 6-year-old girl who is already struggling with body image issues, for example, saying that her tummy is fat, saying that other kids look at her because of this. Mom is concerned that she is eating to soothe big emotions. Mom has incorporated a lot of play therapy skills into her parenting, and we are working through this with child-centered play therapy. Thank you for any information. I really appreciate your podcast. So thank you and I'm actually not using this therapist's name just to protect confidentiality. So know that I'm intentionally not telling you who it is, but the email came from Kansas. So I will let you know that. So the therapist is really kind of actively working with this child, and then mom is struggling to know how to handle this. And this is something that is becoming much more prominent. I think that with social media and with kids being online all the time and having the expectations of the perfect life and the perfect body and the perfect image and the perfect photo and all of that has been driven by the social media craze. I think that younger and younger, we are seeing these types of struggles. And so this is something that we need to not only be aware of, but we also need to make sure that we understand it well, and then therefore that we're handling it effectively. So I really appreciate the email, and we're going to dive in with some thoughts. The path to calm, confident, and in control parenting starts now. All right, so let's go back to some previously discussed topics, but it's worth revisiting because with the 2.0 version, or season 2, if you will, of the Play Therapy Parenting Podcast, I know some of you are new listeners and you have not gone and listened to all of the earlier episodes. So one of the things that we've talked about a lot is that children do not really have control over much in their lives. So when we look at the things over which children do actually have control, it's limited to things you can fit on one hand. So as a general rule, kids can control their eating, their sleeping, their toileting, and their obedience. So it's then very clear and obvious that when a child is fighting for control because they feel that they don't have much control, it's usually going to default to one of those 4 issues, or sometimes more than one. But eating, sleeping, toileting, and obeying are the 4 typical areas with which the child will want power, and they will realize that they actually can take control in those scenarios. So since eating is one of those, we can immediately understand that this is a need for control. And then that begs the question, she is trying to control this area of her life. So the curiosity then is, what has felt out of control in her life? And that can be a variety of things. So it can be big changes. It can be struggles academically. It can be social inadequacy. It can be emotional immaturity. It can be family or situational, a divorce, a separation, a death, a move. What are the scenarios that have felt very out of this child's control? And if you can rule out those types of issues, so if mom is looking at the scenario going, I really don't see that there have really been any kind of big changes or any areas over which she felt like things kind of got really out of her control. If that is ruled out, then we can almost always tie it to very high levels of anxiety. And here's why. When a child is extremely anxious, the way that they deal with their anxiety is trying to take control in another area of their life so that they feel powerful and it's not scary. So when you have a very anxious child, they will often grasp at control. So let's think through eating disorders really quickly. And I don't want to imply that I think this is where this is going. So I just want to be very clear. I don't feel that this 6-year-old girl is moving toward an eating disorder. I just want to help you understand that there's a tie-in here. Because again, eating is a need for control, and high levels of anxiety are almost always associated with eating disorders. So let's unpack this. You have someone who feels that their world is completely out of control, spiraling, they don't have any power over anything. That feels so uncomfortable and so miserable and so scary. Well, I'm going to grasp at any measure of power and control that I can take. So I will either eat too much or I will not eat enough. Because that is something over which I do have control. And we very, very consistently, I've worked with a lot of clients, older clients that have had eating disorders. And we very, very consistently see that the super high levels of anxiety are tied into that. And so if we recognize control and power, that gives us the why. So for this little girl, instead of seeing it as an eating issue, which it really isn't, it's a power and control issue. And/or it's an anxiety issue. So with that as the foundation of root cause, now here are some things that we can do to help the child with that scenario. As she develops more self-esteem, she will naturally feel better about herself, regardless of whether or not she likes her body yet or not. In other words, she doesn't have to get to a point where she's happy with her body or content with her body for the increase in self-esteem to influence the way that she thinks about herself. And one of the universal outcomes of child-centered play therapy is an increase in self-esteem. So as she feels more confident and as she knows that she has self-worth, she will naturally feel better about herself, whether or not her body changes at all. So self-esteem is a big factor in this. Secondly, as she develops an emotional vocabulary, she will handle her big feelings more effectively. So the anxiety will not have the power that it once had over her because she will understand her feelings better and she will be able to accurately identify them and then accurately and effectively communicate them. Because you can have your needs met if you know how to identify and communicate your feelings, which is what we talked about in the Reflecting Feelings episode, right? So as mom, you and therapist are both reflecting her feelings to her, she's developing an emotional vocabulary. Mom and therapist, as you are giving her choices, you are helping her build a sense of self-esteem. As you are using encouragement phrases with her, you are helping her build her self-confidence. So this is all tied together. You see that? And then finally, as she develops self-control and self-regulation, she will have better coping strategies. She will be more resilient. And she will be able to better manage the circumstances in which she finds herself. So even if other kids look at her because she has a pudgy tummy, or even if she thinks that her tummy is fat, or even if she is so consumed by these big feelings that she doesn't know what to do with them, the self-control and the self-regulation that she develops will naturally even all of that out. Because that's one of the universal outcomes of the child-centered play therapy process is self-regulation. And that's regulation across all areas of life. So as those three things continue to grow for her, and mom, if you are using those techniques at home, and therapist, if you are continuing to use those in the playroom, it will naturally sort itself out. And the fact that she's eating to soothe her big emotions, that's just another indication that she has really big feelings, doesn't have coping, doesn't have self-control, doesn't have an emotional vocabulary, and doesn't have self-esteem. This all is connected. But it's very easy to look at this scenario and think this is a food issue. But the beauty of the play therapy process, specifically the child-centered approach, is we understand the undercurrent. We understand the why. We understand what's driving the behavior, because the behavior is just the cue into where the child is struggling or hurting. Let me say that again. The behavior is just the cue to where the child is struggling or hurting. So what she's saying and what she's doing are not actually the issues. That's just what gives us the clue as to what's really going on. And in this case, it's a lack of self-esteem, a lack of emotional vocabulary, a lack of self-regulation, and either super high levels of anxiety or a huge need for power and control. So in context of that, the whole process changes. Not that we adjust anything from the skills that we're using, but we can see it in a different light, and we're no longer trying to address the food and the eating. We're getting to all of the other stuff that's underneath that. So mom and therapist in Kansas, I hope that that's super helpful for you. And for those of you that maybe have that same kind of issue with your own child, you notice that they're super picky with food. They will only eat certain types of things. They'll only eat at certain times of the day. They refuse most things. They eat too much. They hide food in their bedrooms. I mean, I've heard it all, right? This is traditional kid behavior. You don't have to teach it. They just know it, right? So if you are struggling in any capacity with your child and their food, and then as a related aside, or their sleeping, or their toileting, or their obedience, be aware that there is a root cause of power and control. And if you can sort that out, that will equip you with how you can better address it. But remember, your go-to are your 4 pillars. You reflect the child's feelings, you give them choices, you encourage them, and if necessary, you set limits. So the pillars and the approach don't change, but understanding the why always does give us better perspective and insight about how best to handle things. So thank you, therapist and mom in Kansas. I appreciate that question. And if you would like to get signed up for my newsletter, I would love to have you go to playtherapyparenting.com. And then you'll be in the know about everything that we're working on and putting out there. And I'll send you a free birth order workshop too. So I'm super grateful for you. I would love to hear from more of you. If you have questions, if you have comments, even if you would just like to say hello. I love, love, love hearing from listeners. And I do personally read every single email. I know a lot of people think I must have someone that reads them for me or sorts them or filters them or is a gatekeeper in some way. I promise you they come directly to me and I read every single one and I will respond to you. So if you would just like to say hello, you'd like to give me a scenario, you'd like to ask a question, you want to celebrate a success because you've fallen into CCPT and you are loving it and you're seeing the results, please send me an email. I'd love to hear from you, brenna@thekidcounselor.com. You can also you can email me, yes, but you can also call and leave a voicemail for me and I can answer your question that way, 813-812-5525 if you're in the States. Internationally, you're going to have to email me. So anyway, I'm so grateful for each and every one of you. Thank you for continuing to pour into your kids and pour into your family and working on being the best parents that you can be. That is the best job and the best task that you've been given the opportunity to do. So I hope that you feel encouraged and supported, and we will talk again soon. Bye.
Thank you for listening to the Play Therapy Parenting Podcast with Dr. Brenna Hicks. For more episodes and to subscribe to our newsletter, please go to www.playtherapyparenting.com.